All right, everybody, that seems like a good place to start. Today, for our Tree Talk series, we're going to be talking about tree pests and disease. This is a topic that I think is very important for anyone who either deals with trees on a casual basis or is a professional tree caretaker. And whether or not you're in the city or in the forest, I think that it's important and it's very relevant either way. So a little bit about me. I was born in the Cajun capital, Lafayette, Louisiana, and I got my Bachelor of Science degree from Loyola University in New Orleans. And then I went and I did an ecology assistantship in Augusta, Georgia, which really taught me to appreciate just how old trees are and how impressive they are. If you think about it, they can't run away from you with these predator-prey interactions. They just have to sit there and evolve themselves. And so after that, I was on the fence about going to law school. And so I ultimately decided that I really wanted to pursue a degree in natural resources. And so I went to the University of Maine. There I was working with, I did an urban ash tree street study where I was working with the emerald ash borer, and I prepared an emerald ash borer preparedness plan for the town of Orono. So I do have experience with tree pests and disease, more specifically the emerald ash borer. So a little bit of that is my background. So now I'm back in the South, and I really am happy to share all my skills with the community as well as learn from the community as well. So as I said, I worked with the emerald ash borer. So its scientific name is Agaricus planipennis. And it is a threat to all native species of ash in North America. So that's about 8 billion trees overall, and that is 9 species of native ash. And it kills about 98 to 100% of the trees that it infests. So it's a pretty big deal, and you can probably guess why this is a pretty large economic impact as well, as far as the quality of a lot of our ash trees. So backing up, there is a little bit of tree history, I think, that is important to understanding the tree pests and disease interactions. So if we back way up, about 350 to 400 million years ago, there were these trees that were not quite trees yet. The prehistoric trees were more like ferns, and they started slowly evolving into these larger versions of ferns that eventually became woody. And so this is actually a 19th century rendition of a Carboniferous forest. So that actually means coal bearing. And I kind of went down a rabbit hole initially about, how trees actually initially started to break down very slowly because they didn't really have a lot of these tree pests and disease feeding on them and a lot of the bacteria that broke them down. So way back in the day, they actually didn't really have that much of those kinds of interactions. And so to put it into a little bit more context, there is this way more history of trees. There's 400 million years ago, there was a Carboniferous forest, and then 245 to 266 million years ago, there were dinosaurs that kind of, again, had that kind of predator-prey, or I guess just predation interactions. Thankfully, trees don't prey on things. And so then 65 million years ago, obviously, we all know that an asteroid hit, no more dinosaurs, but there were these small mammals that actually fed on a lot of the seeds, and that kind of created more tree diversity. So palms started to replace ferns as a dominant landscape species. And then 200,000 years later, these walnut type seeds started to increase mammal diversity. And then 700,000 years after that, legumes evolved a little bit more and mammal diversity increased even more. And this is all just to put this ecological time scale on trees, because millions of years ago is a long time in the scale of human evolution. So to the point, this is kind of our main time scale, was 22,000 years ago, where it's the Ice Age. New York is buried under about half a mile of ice. There is, humans have, again, to put it into context, domesticated dogs about 16,000 years ago. And then way going forward, there was the Industrial Revolution. And to put that little dot into perspective, I put Shakespeare on there because that's just to show that once the Industrial Revolution got going, a lot more pests were able to move around because we just started moving around the world, and a lot of these pests were introduced very quickly. And so it didn't really allow the trees that kind of evolutionary time scale to adjust to a lot of these pests. So my point is, ecological interactions have been happening for a long time compared with the human timeline. And so I have some tips before looking at your trees. You have to ask yourself, has there been a change in environmental conditions? Has there been an unusually hot, dry, wet, or humid period, such as, for instance, this past May, where it was very hot and very dry? And so those can kind of put stressors on trees, and they can be more susceptible to insect and disease outbreaks. So also another question would be, are there outbreaks nearby? So if you ask yourself, have I seen anything odd? Or you talk to your local arborist or university extension, they are incredible resources. It's also a good idea to see if that tree species is prone to certain diseases. For instance, ash is prone to emerald ash borer, beech is prone to beech bark disease. And these are all just very important questions to ask yourself. And I thought it was really important to clarify signs versus symptoms. So I really simplified it in this slide, but I think it's important to know that signs is whenever an insect affects a tree. And so that can be marks on leaves or on the trunk. So these are signs that the insect has been there, and a sign that the insect itself has made on the tree. It's different from a symptom, which is how the tree interacts with that insect as kind of a reaction to what the insect was doing. So that would be something such as tree wilting or sap flow and the like. And so, for instance, whenever I was doing my work on emerald ash borer, some signs were the D-shaped holes that the borer left whenever it exited the tree, and blonding, which occurs because the tree is weakened, and it basically happens when woodpeckers come to forage on the tree and they scrape off the bark. And so there are also galleries, which are insect houses. It's insects that burrow into the bark of the tree will leave these galleries as they're making their homes to lay their eggs and produce that next round of pests. And so there are also notches in the leaves, for instance, from the pest eating the leaf. And so a reaction or a symptom that the tree would show is epicormic branching, which is basically extra branches that the tree puts out because it is stressed. And there are also dead branches that may also die because the tree can't get the nutrients from the sap flow that it normally would. So those branches would die. It's also worth noting that there are actually a lot of native lookalikes. So again, with my research, for instance, there was an emerald ash borer looked a lot like our native tiger beetle. And to the casual observer, it looks like a green beetle. They both look like green beetles, but you can see that there are slight differences in the eyes, in the antennae, and the waist. So you can kind of see that, if you look very closely, there are differences in the native flora and fauna, and especially in these insect species, although they are very hard to see. So this is important. And I think a funny story actually to prove my point a little bit more is that my downstairs neighbor asked me, she said, I saw a tick in my house, and I had to laugh because, we're in the middle of the city and she hadn't been on a hike or anything. So I said, okay, next time you see this tick, can you show me a photo of it and I can try and identify it? And so she said, sure. So she sends me this photo, which is not a tick. It is a weevil. And I thought that was kind of funny because to me, they look very different because I actually worked at an insectarium also. So I think that there are a lot of differences whenever I look at that. But if someone who doesn't really know bugs that well, they just look at a brown bug that is very small and they say, oh, that could be a tick. And that's totally fair because, you know, you always want to keep an eye out for pests that can harm you as well. So it's worth noting that because there is confusion sometimes, it's best not to do your own pest control. So don't DIY pest control ever. There are licenses that you need to do this, and there are courses that you need to take to actually understand the differences. But this is a really good start that you're here because I think that it's great to actually learn some of the differences in these pests. So the first one that I wanted to talk about was beetles. Beetles are incredibly interesting as an insect species. They actually have the largest diversity of any species. So there's about 500,000 species of beetles. And most of the ones in this photo are actually non-native. So they are invasive. And that goes back again to that timeline of just being introduced very quickly and not giving the trees enough time to adjust. So the first one that I wanted to talk about was the Japanese beetle, or Popilia japonica. And its hosts are the Japanese maple, crepe myrtle, along with apples, plums, apricots, cherries, peach, pin oak, sassafras, and linden. So you may have noticed that a lot of those were agricultural species. So this is actually more of an agricultural pest, but sometimes you can see it on trees as well, and it will target some trees. So some of the signs of this beetle are skeletonized leaves, which you can see at the bottom right here. And some of the symptoms can sometimes be dead grass patches on your lawn, and this is due to the grubs emerging. That's not to say that anytime you see dead grass patches on your lawn, that is the cause. And that is something that you have to look for whenever you're looking for pests and disease, is these kind of confusing symptoms, which we'll go over later. The active period is in the summer. Most insects' active period is in the summer because, you know, it's just a very opportunistic time for them. It's more ideal than the winter, where temperatures, they can actually slow down a lot physically. And there are lookalikes, which are they look very similar in my mind. One is a green June bug, where the arrow is pointing, the bottom right. And actually, I've seen both of these in person, which has been pretty impressive. The green June bug is a bit bigger than the Japanese beetle, but nonetheless, again, it is important to understand the differences between these because they look so similar. And so I wanted to put this diagram up. I thought it was a really well illustrated diagram of kind of the emergence and the timing of a lot of this beetle in particular. I wish they had more. I wish they had more of these for different species, because I think that it's a really great visualization to see that when they emerge. And as you can see, it is June through August. And so there's also the Redbay Ambrosia beetle. That's a pretty big one around here. That's happening, you know, just kind of having its moment out here. The hosts are the Redbay and sassafras, as well as avocado. And so it's a lot of the Lauraceae family, which is the laurel family. It's actually important because it carries Laurel Wilt, which is another disease that I will mention later. A lot of beetles are actually, they carry a lot of diseases. So that's kind of a double impact when they're making these galleries. And they're also carrying these, maybe a fungus and a disease on their legs when they actually enter the tree. So it creates a really easy entry point for disease. And so some of the signs of this would be these sawdust strings, such as the photo on the bottom here. Some of the symptoms you might see are wilting leaves and dieback. Some of the active periods, again, are those spring and fall. It's actually spring through fall, so it's kind of a bit of a longer period that it's active. One of the lookalikes actually is a pine bark beetle, and which is this upcoming species, so you will see. The galleries that it creates are also very affect the tree a lot. So this is an instance of what a gallery looks like. So this would be underneath the bark, and it really disrupts all of the energy transport of the tree. And so you can kind of see that if a tree's energy sources, its carbon stores are kind of moving back and forth, left to right, you can see all of these cut throughs where they're just cutting off the whole thing. So this is the pine bark beetle. The southern pine bark beetle is actually native to this area, but it is considered invasive because it has moved to other ranges. And so most of that is due to human transport as well, and just kind of the movement of a lot of lumber just back and forth. So there are, the hosts are pine species, and it's a lot of pine species. The signs are pitch tubes, which are basically when the insect burrows into the bark, you can actually see the pine pitch kind of form this tube around where they burrowed. So some of the symptoms are needles changing colors from pale to yellow green, and then red, and then brown. So you can probably see within about a year or so just how drastic that change would be. And so again, the active period would be summer. I don't think there's too much surprises. It's not, most insects are active in the summer, and then a lot of diseases are kind of active all year round. So again, the lookalike would probably be the Redbay Ambrosia beetle, and there are other pretty confusing beetle species out there because there's just a lot of diversity, again, amongst beetles. So the chances that you're going to see a brown beetle are pretty high. The chances that you're going to see a brown beetle that is not Redbay Ambrosia or pine bark beetle are pretty high. So another one that's around here is the Asian longhorn beetle, which personally I like the look of. I don't like the effects. I think that they're a really interesting looking beetle, but they are not native and they are pretty destructive. Some of their hosts are maples and horse chestnut, so a lot of hardwoods. And the signs would be that maybe there's sawdust near the tree from whenever the insect burrows into the tree and kind of kicks out a lot of that sawdust. And so you'll see these pencil-sized holes around the bark from them burrowing either into it or their larvae coming out with a lot of beetle species. So the symptoms would be yellowing leaves. Again, with a lot of these trees, what you'll see is just a dramatic shift in the coloration of the leaves whenever it's not really supposed to happen. Either they're evergreen species or it's not anywhere near fall. So a lot of lookalikes. Well, there's the Sawyer beetle, which actually looks very similar to it. And the Sawyer beetle has, as you can see, that red arrow there is pointing to a white dot on the back of that beetle, and that's the Sawyer beetle, as opposed to the top left image, which is the Asian longhorn beetle. So again, it's important that you don't, indiscriminately go out, and if you see something and you think it's not native, or if you think it's invasive, don't kill it yourself. Just note it, and I think it would be great to note it on maybe an app like iNaturalist is a really good one to get some confirmation. Or you can contact your local extension and just say, here's what I think I saw. The eyed click beetle also looks like it. And I think it's a very interesting insect that is native and that you definitely don't want to kill, because a lot of these species play a very important role in the ecology. And so it's important not to take that on yourself. Pine weevils are also a very interesting species. A lot of the pine species. So the SPP at the end of Posodes means species. So if you go back and watch my taxonomy and ID talk, you'll see that Posodes is actually the genus and the SPP stands for species. So it's kind of, there are multiple. So that means that also there are multiple pine species that host this beetle. So the signs would be white grubs at the leader. And a leader of a tree is actually, it's a dominant upright stem that is on a tree. So normally on a pine tree, you'll see, this pyramidal shape, and there is typically one branch that is higher than the rest that is called the leader. And so you'll see sometimes on younger trees, you'll see white grubs at a leader at the tip, and you'll see spongy bark near the leader as well. And so some of the symptoms are basically poor leader health. And what happens when you have poor leader health, this is really important for the timber industry and also just for the pine trees form. Sometimes you'll have the weevil will eat the leader or damage the leader. And what happens is another branch will form on the side to compete with the leader. And it basically winds up giving the tree a pretty poor form. And that's bad in the timber industry because it's just not the most ideal wood to cut. And it's also not the most ideal for a healthy tree. So again, the active period would be the warmer weather months. And so spring through summer. There are lookalikes such as the flower beetles. Again, if you just see a black beetle on the ground, maybe do your research into looking at what other kinds of invasive species there are out there to see what, there are a lot of pages that show lookalikes, which is a really fascinating thing to look up. So ants actually can also are kind of on the fence. I did include them mostly because I want to talk about when we do work, how ants can be a little bit not ideal. And so there's Carpenter ants, which are Camponotus species. So the hosts are dead and dying trees. So Carpenter ants generally won't kill the tree. They mostly go for dead and dying trees. The reason that they can kind of be a nuisance is they can actually affect the structural integrity of the tree. So there are signs that they can be in the tree, which, as I mentioned before, there are sawdust, maybe sprinklings. Generally, if you see sawdust near a tree, it's not the greatest sign, but it is always worth further investigation. So I don't think there are no symptoms, because if it doesn't damage the tree's not going to show really any symptoms. If it's already dead and dying, it's probably showing symptoms from something else. So it's worth looking around and just being really careful about dead and dying trees and how susceptible they are to carpenter ants and other forms of decay. So the active period would probably be summer to mid-fall. And some of the lookalikes maybe include termites or other ant species. Fire ants, for instance, kind of look like them. And so some people do get confused. And so I wanted to talk about what happens when we plant trees, which is, we'll plant a tree and then we'll put what's called a gator bag around it, which helps. It's basically a water bag to assist the tree with its water needs when it's not getting enough from either external sources. So it's a good way to water the tree. So what we'll do is we'll go up and we'll remove the bag only to find that there is a fire ant nest all around the tree. And the fire ants have just completely claimed this little space as their own. And sometimes it happens when people are not filling the bags, or if they have dried out and they've just been sitting there for a minute. It's a really good place for fire ants. And the danger with this is for young trees, especially, that the moisture can get trapped around the tree base, and then that can lead to susceptibility to other infections, such as other fungal infections, for instance. And so other ant species are very interesting to me because while people who are trying to propagate fruit species, they might be pretty troublesome. But the interesting thing is that a lot of ant species actually kind of know their tree, if you will. There is in quotes, and they kind of understand their tree versus another tree. So what'll happen is they'll actually, in a way, protect the tree because they know that that is their territory. And so while a lot of farmers and people who own orchards maybe don't want these on their tree because of the integrity of the fruit, it can actually be beneficial for the tree in a way. Tent caterpillars are normally of not too much concern, but they can defoliate trees. Normally, the leaves will grow back, and trees actually have this incredible ability to what's called flush out their leaves. So basically, they can drop their leaves up to 3 or 4 times before they really don't have any more carbon storage left, and they start to really go downhill and die. So tent caterpillars, although they can defoliate the trees pretty severely, are generally not too much of a problem down here. A really interesting species is the gypsy moth. It's generally farther north, and it does prefer oak species. It defoliates trees as well, meaning that it basically will strip it of its leaves. But it does avoid a lot of maples, which I think is a very interesting thing, because when you're planting trees and selecting trees or wondering what pests and disease can affect one tree or another, it's always very important to understand the tree pests and disease that are around your area so that you know what you're expecting. You don't want to plant something in your backyard if you know that there's, for instance, ash. I wouldn't probably plant ash in my backyard because I know that it pretty much demolishes 98 to 100% of the species that it infests. And so you have to be smart about this, about planting and planning. So the Oriental fruit moth is another one. So it actually likes peaches and nectarines, but it's not of too much concern in this area just yet. But it is important to, if you are trying to grow fruit, maybe inspect your fruit and make sure that there's nothing inside it, because Oriental fruit moths can actually lay eggs inside the fruit. So let's talk about diseases. Mostly there are 3 types. There's fungal diseases, bacterial diseases, and then there are diseases that can be carried by nematodes, which is pretty interesting. So let's talk about fungal diseases. Anthracnose is unsightly, but not deadly. So this is a term that covers, it's a general term for fungal infected leaves or trees that, it's a minor nuisance to the trees, but it's not completely going to take them out. And so it was important for me at least to include a lot of these diseases that are not completely major. There is a middle ground between wiping out 98 to 100% of the trees and anthracnose. I think that it's a reason that if you see fungal looking spores or mats on your leaves, not to panic. So it's not, if you see something, definitely ask an extension or ask your local arborist or call us. Another one would be powdery mildew. That's pretty popular on a lot of plant species this time of year. So what you'll see is pale yellow leaf spots, and then this kind of white, almost, I guess it almost kind of looks like floury substance, and it kind of feels like that on the leaf as well. And a lot of the prevention is mostly just having a lot of the plants that are supposed to be in the sun, and then to selectively prune areas that are affected, as well as maybe pick a variety that is a variety of plant that is resistant to it. Another one would be root rot. So that would be, the host is actually many species because it's just a fungus that infects a lot of species if they are being overwatered or if there's poor drainage. So some of the symptoms are stunting or wilting and discolored leaves and brown roots. So oftentimes you'll see the bottom, the roots are supposed to be kind of a whitish color. They're not supposed to be brown, minus that's not including obviously the soil on it, but the roots are not supposed to be brown and rotting. And so the active period is really in season. And this goes back to when you are looking at any sort of changes in weather, whether or not, this is of note, whether or not you've gotten a lot of rain or have gone through an unusually wet period. So Seiridium Canker is another one. Thankfully, I guess it has only one host, mostly Wheelan cypress. Some of the symptoms would be browning of the branches during drought. So pretty much anytime that a tree has a random, what's called flagging, which is basically whenever the tree branches die pretty randomly. And so the active period would also be during the hot and dry months. And what you could do about this is basically that you could plant a resistant species, which is pretty much the only viable method of control. And fungicides prolong the death, but they don't prevent it. So a lot of these non-native diseases and pests, it's really the method of treatment is just basically not allowing them to get it in the first place, which is why it's so important to have preventative action. So there's also Laurel Wilt, which is the hosts are the Laurel family. So that's sassafras, avocado, redbay. So it's really something that is impacting the avocado industry. And so, like I said, the redbay ambrosia beetle can carry this. And so the symptoms are drooping leaves, red or purple leaves, not in the fall, or kind of at an unusual time, and the active period would be hot and dry months. And a lot of the times with diseases, we talk about mortality rate. So the mortality rate, for instance, for the emerald ash borer would be 98 to 100%. Meanwhile, the laurel wilt mortality rate is anywhere from 75 to 97%. And it's also of concern that oak wilt is in this country, and it affects the red oak family very quickly. It actually affects the white oak family more slowly. So that would include, the scarlet oak, for instance, is a red oak, and the white, obviously a white oak is a white oak, and the swamp white oak is also a white oak. The symptoms would be rapid leaf discoloration and wilting. And so I included a photo here where you can kind of see how quickly a lot of that wilting is spreading. The active period or outbreak would be late June to early July. There's also what's called sudden oak death. It's a very dramatic name, but I think it does highlight the importance of how quickly these diseases can actually take over a tree. So the host would be oaks and tan oak species. Again, the symptoms would be flagging. So there's also or cankers, which are dead sections of bark on branches or main trunks of trees. And it spreads via spores. So that's basically, it's called foliar spread. And that basically means that it spreads via the leaves. It can also spread if it rains and a drop of water has a spore and it splashes to another part of the plant. And it's mainly in California now, but it definitely can move. All of these diseases can move, and they do. They move very quickly sometimes, especially when there are human forces at play. Recently in Savannah, there has been a Sugarberry Dieback. And so I put those question marks there because a lot of, scientists are still trying to figure out what exactly is causing it. It first showed up, I believe, in 2009, and its host is Sugarberry. The symptoms would be progressive crown deterioration and yellowing of the canopy. If you see sugarberries around town, you'll notice that they are not healthiest looking, and that's because of this kind of mystery disease that is hitting them. There have been over 1,000 sugarberry trees that have died within the city of Savannah, with the removal costs being over $250,000. So the culprit, they think, is this cute little bug, unfortunately, that is also invasive. But it is the Asian woolly aphid, sorry. So they are thinking that this either takes over the tree by, basically feeding off of it severely and stressing out the tree to the point where it is to the point that it becomes susceptible because of the stress, or they think that it might carry a fungus with it that they just haven't identified yet. And so there are also bacterial diseases that trees can get, which I did not know of until fairly recently. And mostly that's bacterial wetwood, so that's slime flux. And the host, it really affects a lot of species. It happens because of this term called included bark, which is basically when the tree rubs up against another part of itself, and it rubs up on the bark, and so it creates this kind of entry point for disease. And it can also happen on poorly pruned trees because if you remove a portion of the tree when you prune it, you can actually take away the tree's ability to defend itself or to kind of release those natural chemicals that would otherwise prevent a lot of the bacterial and fungal infections. So the symptoms would be oozing bark. So that's the wet looking bark. It's actually because this bacteria is causing fermentation under the bark. And so it's causing a lot of pressure to be released in the tree. And so the active period would really be any season. It's mostly after a very wet period. And so that's another thing to look out for. What I also thought was interesting was that nematodes can really mess up the root systems of trees. And mostly that's whenever soil is moved around or tools are not sanitized properly. So farming tools, for instance, if they are moved around, the symptoms can be confused with abiotic symptoms. And so the active period is really any season, especially because down here we don't really have that kind of frost layer. So a lot of these diseases just can kind of thrive year round. And so what will happen with these nematodes is that they will parasitize roots and cause root knots. So there are some confusing signs and symptoms. Sapsuckers really look like it looks like the tree is diseased if it's been targeted pretty intensely by sapsuckers. Normally you can see, and that's not to say that sapsuckers don't create entry points for disease themselves sometimes, but you can actually tell the difference between, maybe a wood borer insect and a sapsucker, because a lot of the times the holes that the sapsucker makes will be in a fairly straight line, whereas a lot of the insect borer holes are more sporadic. There's also lichen. Lichen has a perfectly symbiotic relationship with trees, and it looks like a disease, but it's really not, and it's perfectly normal. It can sometimes look like white rot, but otherwise that would be up to an arborist to determine the difference if you're very curious. A lot of the times, like I said, native bugs also look very similar to invasive species. Drought stress can also look pretty similar to some of the diseases, because whenever trees get stressed, the first thing that they do is kind of take nutrients away from their outer canopy. So the tips of branches sometimes will die off. And that's always good to check on as well to catch anything early. It's better to catch something early or be unsure about it and call someone than to just leave it. Mushrooms are kind of an exception here. They're a weird middle ground, because while mushrooms are not necessarily the problem, they can indicate signs of other problems to be aware of, since they feed off dead materials in trees. So the bottom line here is to look for significant and insignificant signs of symptoms and really just be aware of your tree's health. And then there's also another confusing thing that can happen is abiotic versus biotic. So basically non-living things like the weather versus living things such as bacteria and insects and fungal disease. So the abiotic, or the non-living things, would be something like chlorosis, where it's yellowing leaves with green veins. So the outside will be pretty yellow, and then the inside will you'll see kind of the outline of the veins in green. And that actually indicates a lack of magnesium. And so a lack of nitrogen can also be an issue, because the edge of leaf turns brown and crispy and turns downward. but that also happens when it's been drought stressed, or there are other things that can cause these indications or these symptoms. So I guess, overall, the main signs to look for are the things that the pest itself can cause are, the holes in the tree and the sawdust kind of looking areas. And for diseases, you really want to look for oozing or mushrooms or powder-like substances on the leaves, or any flagging and dieback. And some symptoms, again, would be rapid color change in the leaves or needles, large amounts of wilting leaves, branch dieback, or flagging. And so as far as treatment options go, there are mostly biological, chemical, or physical. So a lot of the time, obviously, we all know about pesticides, and that is an option that we have. A lot of land managers try not to use them because, insects can, and even fungal infections and bacterial infections can all adapt to different kinds of chemical treatments. So what they'll do sometimes is they'll use biological treatments or physical barriers. Sometimes people, for ants at least, will wrap the tree in a certain kind of like plastic. That is not recommended too much, because a lot of people do forget about these physical barriers and leave them on the tree. So if you ever put a physical barrier on a tree, be sure to pay attention to it. A lot of trees will outgrow their physical barriers no matter where they are. Integrated pest management basically is a mix of all of the above three: biological, chemical, and physical controls. So basically it takes the landowner goals into consideration as well. So whether or not the landowner, prefers to use more chemical or physical boundaries, or wants more biological control. And, if you work with an arborist or you call your university extension office, you can usually talk to them and ask them what the best course of action is to do. In my mind, IPM is a more well-rounded way of managing pests. And so, as I said, it just takes way more into consideration. So is there a lesson here? Absolutely. That's why I just spent a long time talking about it. It's very wise to diversify species selections. And this is because, you never know. I mean, we do know what's around. And so in silviculture, which is the art and science of growing trees, and it's mostly happens in the forest. But if we look at our urban forest as such, then we should diversify species selections, because insect and disease outbreaks can really affect any area. And especially with the movement of humans, it can move very quickly. So if you diversify your species selections, if you increase diversity of the genetics in a tree, that gives it a little bit more resistance. Or if you diversify your actual species selection, I guess if you plant, for instance, a lot of one species, say it's all ash, and you have emerald ash borer, you are going to lose a lot of trees. And so, this can happen with other tree pests and disease that are not just emerald ash borer. When I was doing my presentation for Maine, I was looking at all of these public places that had ash trees and just thinking they're going to lose a lot of ash trees because 40 years ago, they planted a lot of ash trees. So, it's important. And it's important also to protect your plants. So, in any way that you can. I know that, there's only so much that we can do, but it's important to protect your plants by being aware of this diversity, this need for diversity, and being aware of your trees and others. And again, please don't DIY pest control. So what can you do? You can sanitize pruning tools. If you're moving your pruning tools around, it's best to do it in between each individual. So basically, if you're pruning one tree, just sanitize them before you go to the other one. And you can do that by using isopropyl alcohol And there are many other ways that you can sanitize your pruning tools, but that is very important. It's also important not to transport firewood. When we come up on, winter and you want to go camping, try to get your firewood as locally as possible and do not transport it, especially across state lines. The species selections, as I mentioned, are also very important. If you have a cultivar, cultivars are really great for the reason that they could be completely resistant to tree pests and disease, or because they can lack genetic diversity sometimes, then it's just important that you don't plant a bunch that can be wiped out. So also follow state regulations. They are there for a reason. There are a ton of scientists and researchers behind it. And, it's always good to talk to an arborist and talk to your local extension office about the state regulations. And if you're not sure, UGA is a great place to look up these regulations, and also just stay informed. You can, you're doing great by starting here. So yeah, just stay informed and you'll be fine. There are additional resources. Our website, for instance, there is a local arborist list that we have. I have included the little flow chart to go there. So if you go to savannahtree.org, then you go to the Learn tab, and then you go to Downloads, and that is our local arborist list. There's also the UGA Extension Office, so that's extension.uga.edu. Again, statewide, there's the UGA Extension as well. There's a Forest Health Guide, which I actually use a lot of for this PowerPoint. It's incredible. There is, if you just Google Forest Health Guide, it's a PDF document, and it's a lot of tree pests and disease that are around in Georgia. And nationwide, there is APHIS, which is the Animal Plant Health Inspection Service. So that is also a really great resource for any of your tree pest and disease questions. Speaking of questions, I will open up the floor to anybody who would like to ask me a question and see if I can answer that. Well, if anybody has any questions, and I'm very happy to search out high and low all these answers. Just be sure to email us at info@savannahtree.com. And yeah, thank you for being here. And I hope you all have a great day.